He wasn't supposed to survive this story. The moment Milo Hart opened his eyes in a stranger's body, the plot had already condemned him to disgrace, the ending every discarded villain gets. But the man meant to destroy him refused to play his part. Instead of walking away, Sebastian Voss backed him into a corner, tipped his chin up with one finger, and said words no villain in that novel was ever supposed to hear. "You're mine, and I'm rewriting the ending myself." Obsessive, possessive, impossible to escape. What does a man like that want with someone the whole world already decided to throw away? Watch till the end to find out exactly how far he's willing to go. Get comfortable, because today we're telling you about Milo Hart, a guy who wakes up inside a novel only to discover he's the one the male lead is supposed to destroy. Except the male lead has very different plans. If you've ever had someone look at you like they'd tear the whole plan apart just to keep you close, drop a comment and tell us who that person was. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd spend every single morning of my marriage staring at a folder of divorce papers I'm too much of a coward to actually file, I would have laughed in your face. Back then, I was still the kind of idiot who thought love was the finish line, not the starting gun. On paper, I am Milo Hart, husband of Sebastian Voss, heir to the Voss dynasty. A man so polished and untouchable that strangers on the street stopped to stare at him the way people stare at weather events. Cold, controlled, devastatingly correct in every way a person can be correct. His photograph has been used, without his permission or knowledge, on at least 3 husband material listicles that I know of, and probably several more that I don't. That's the version of him the world gets. I get the other one. The one who, when I slide the folder across the breakfast table for the 4th time this month, doesn't even look up from his coffee. He just reaches over, tips my chin up with one finger, and says, in that low, amused voice that has ruined my life on multiple occasions, "You're the one who seduced me first, Milo. You don't get to walk away from your own crime scene." I did not seduce you, I say, for the 400th time in our marriage. You cornered me in a private room at a party and kissed me without asking. I asked, he says. You just don't remember it because you were too busy melting. I want to throw the coffee at him. I don't, because he'd probably enjoy that too, and because some small, humiliated part of me knows he's not entirely wrong about the melting. This is where the story actually starts making sense, though. Not here, not in this kitchen with its ridiculous marble countertops he insisted on, but 2 years earlier, in a body that used to belong to someone else, in a novel I never meant to fall into. I didn't die dramatically. There was no truck, no white light, no dignified last words. I fell asleep on the couch reading fan fiction on my phone, with a bag of pretzels going stale on my chest. And I woke up as somebody named Milo Hart, 17 years old, standing in the doorway of a private school gymnasium, holding a water bottle I did not remember buying, wearing a school uniform I did not remember putting on, in a body that was taller and leaner and infinitely more photogenic than the one I'd fallen asleep in. For about 4 days I assumed I was having an extremely detailed dream. I went to classes on autopilot, borrowing Milo's muscle memory for things like locker combinations and homeroom seating charts, and told myself I'd wake up any minute back in my own bed with my own unremarkable face. I did not wake up. It took me exactly 1 week of quiet panic and increasingly frantic internet searches on Milo's phone to figure out where, and what, I'd landed in. The search history did most of the work for me. Browser tabs pinned open to a web novel titled Claimed, chapters bookmarked, comment threads scrolled halfway to the bottom. Milo, the real one, whoever or whatever he'd been before I showed up wearing his face, had apparently been an obsessive reader of his own story without ever realizing it. The novel was, to put it delicately, an 18-plus boys' love serial with a plot so thin you could read it through in an evening. Cold, gorgeous air falls for a sweet transfer student against a backdrop of elite private school politics and family empire drama, and along the way there's a jealous schemix who tries to sabotage the romance at every turn and gets exactly what's coming to him by the final act. I was the ex, not the hero, not even the tragic rival who gets a last-minute redemption arc and a bittersweet goodbye scene. I was the villain, Milo Hart, the discarded fiancé, petty and vindictive and increasingly unhinged as the story progressed, who spends 200 chapters trying to ruin the real love story before getting his comeuppance in the ugliest way a web novel author can imagine for a side character nobody's rooting for. I remembered the ending before I remembered anything else about my new life, and that tells you everything about how badly it goes for me. Sebastian Voss was, by every metric the school gossip mill could produce, the most eligible bachelor to ever walk the halls of Kingsley Preparatory Academy. Heir to a hospitality and tech empire that had its name on half the luxury hotels in the country, top of every class he bothered to show up for, disturbingly handsome in the specific way that makes people forget how to finish sentences around him. Even his handwriting looked expensive. He was also, according to every classmate who'd ever tried, completely unavailable. Confessions bounced off him like rain off glass. Not cruelly, just with an efficiency that somehow stung worse than cruelty would have. He didn't do drama, didn't do relationships, didn't do anything but exist at the top of the food chain, while the rest of us scrambled for a fraction of his attention like it was oxygen. I had scrambled harder than anyone. 2 years of chasing him, according to Milo's diary entries, I found buried in a desk drawer. 2 years of engineered hallway run-ins and carefully forgotten lunches he never once shared. 2 years of being turned down so gently and so completely that it barely even registered as rejection anymore. It was just weather. Something that happened to me on a schedule, 3 or 4 times a semester, like clockwork. Then, right at the start of our senior year, Theo Marsh transferred in, and the weather changed for good. Theo had a face built for sympathy, soft eyes, an easy blush, the kind of gentle prettiness that made people want to protect him before he'd said a single word. He also had, and I want to be fair here, absolutely no subtlety whatsoever. His attempts to get close to Sebastian were so clumsy they were almost charming. Dropped books at exactly the right moment. Accidental hallway collisions timed to the second. A running performance of helplessness so consistent it should have been suspicious to anyone paying attention. Nobody was paying attention. It was working. Every time some other guy in our grade tried to get close to Sebastian, Theo materialized within minutes with a warning look sharp enough to cut glass, and then turned right back into a wilting flower the second Sebastian glanced his way. In public, he was composed, almost regal, the kind of person other students deferred to without quite knowing why. Around Sebastian specifically, his voice went soft and breathless in a way that made my teeth hurt. I used to think Sebastian was too smart to fall for it. I was wrong about a lot of things that year. I found the memory the way you find a bruise you forgot you had, by accident, pressing on it while looking for something else, and then wincing at how much it still hurt underneath. Freshman orientation, the real Milo's memories told me, had been held in the same gymnasium where I'd first woken up in his body 3 years later, which felt like the kind of detail a lazy novelist would insert on purpose and call symbolism. 14 years old, new uniform still stiff at the collar, he had been assigned a seating chart buddy for the welcome assembly, and that buddy had been Sebastian Voss. He wasn't cold yet, not back then. Or rather, he was, but it read differently on a 14-year-old. More like shyness dressed up as reserve, a kid who'd been taught his whole life that the safest thing to do in a room full of strangers was say as little as possible and let his last name do the talking instead. "You're staring," he'd said, not unkindly, when Milo spent the first 20 minutes of the assembly sneaking looks at him, instead of listening to the headmaster's speech. "You're the guy from the hotel commercials," Milo had blurted, mortified the second it left his mouth. Something had flickered across Sebastian's face, not quite a smile, but close, the corner of his mouth twitching before he smoothed it back down into practiced neutrality. "I was 7 in that commercial. I don't recommend bringing it up if you want me to keep talking to you." It was, according to the diary entries I'd read, the single longest conversation Milo had with him for the rest of that freshman year. Something shifted after that, not in Sebastian, who simply went back to being unreachable the way he was with everyone, but in Milo, who decided, somewhere in the space of that one exchange, that he'd found the person worth spending years chasing. It took until sophomore year for the quiet admiration to curdle into something more active, the engineered run-ins, the forgotten lunches, which is why, by the time I inherited this body at the start of senior year, it had calcified into exactly 2 years of the kind of devotion aimed at someone who barely remembered the conversation that started it. Reading it back with the hindsight of an entirely different life, I understood something the original Milo never had the distance to see. It was never really about Sebastian, not the actual person, not at first. It was about being the one person who'd made him almost smile in a room full of strangers, and mistaking that for something it hadn't had the chance to become yet. I wasn't sure, most days, whether I was trying to fix Milo's story or just trying not to repeat it. The night everything clicked into place, I dreamed the whole novel from the beginning, start to finish, in a single unbroken stretch of sleep, and I woke up so certain that it was real that I checked my own hands for blood before I remembered where I was. In the dream, in the story, I spend a year and a half trying to derail Theo and Sebastian's romance out of pure, ugly jealousy. I forge messages. I spread rumors. I accidentally ruin a project Theo spent a month on. Every scheme fails. Every plan backfires, more spectacularly each time, until the whole narrative machinery of the novel is grinding toward one single satisfying purpose, making sure everyone in the story, and everyone reading it, hates me by the final chapter. It works. By the final act, I've become such a spectacle of humiliation and cruelty that the whole school turns on me. My name gets dragged through every gossip account in the city. My parents lose their business contracts overnight because nobody wants to be associated with the family that raised that heart boy. My mother's hair goes gray within a season, and she stops leaving the house. My father ends up in a hospital bed with a heart monitor beeping beside him, staring at the ceiling, not saying anything to me at all when I visit, because there's nothing left to say. Sebastian never once looks back at any of it. In the dream, in the story, he simply moves on. To Theo, to the life the novel always intended for him, while I get quietly written out of existence, disgraced, alone, and forgotten by everyone who used to matter to me. I lay there in the dark afterward, hands shaking, and made myself a promise. Whatever this was, a warning, a curse, a very specific kind of insanity. I was done playing the part I'd been written for. I didn't care what it cost me. I would rather be a nobody in this story than the villain in somebody else's love song. The problem was that knowing the plot and being able to stop it turned out to be two very different skills. The first crack in the story happened on an ordinary Tuesday, when our homeroom teacher stepped out to take a phone call and left Sebastian to work a calculus problem on the board in her absence, a small honor reserved for whoever was topping the class that month, which, unsurprisingly, was always him. I watched him work. I always watched him. That was the whole tragedy of me, the thing 2 years of heartbreak hadn't managed to cure, and something in his face changed halfway through writing his answer. He set the chalk down, turned, and caught me staring, and instead of the usual flicker of polite disinterest I'd grown used to, there was a beat of genuine surprise on his face, like he was seeing me for the first time in 2 years instead of the 400th. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did I. I dropped my eyes to my notebook so fast I nearly gave myself whiplash, cheeks burning, furious at my own body for reacting like nothing had changed even though everything had. When the teacher came back and reassigned seats for the new unit, and Theo, predictably, ended up beside him. I could have sworn Sebastian's eyes drifted back toward me more than once that period, in a way that had nothing to do with the story I'd memorized, and everything to do with something I didn't have a name for yet. I told myself it didn't matter. I had a plan. Stay small, stay boring, let the story happen to somebody else. Don't get close enough to change anything, and don't get close enough to get hurt. It lasted about 3 weeks. By the time Theo had been at Kingsley a full semester, half the school had accepted what should have been obvious from day one. Theo Marsh was the only person alive who could sit next to Sebastian Voss and not get quietly relocated within a week. Every girl and guy before him had tried. Sebastian's desk had been a graveyard of failed proximity for 2 straight years. The running joke in our grade was that sitting next to him was a career-limiting move, socially speaking, because he'd have you moved before the ink dried on the new seating chart. Then Theo scored second in the class on the midterm rankings, walked straight to the empty seat beside him after results were posted without asking anyone's permission, and just stayed. The whole room held its breath waiting for Sebastian to do what he always did. He didn't. I watched it happen from 2 rows back and felt something in my chest go cold and certain, the exact temperature of a plot clicking back into place despite everything I'd tried to do to stop it. This was supposed to be the beginning. The story wanted them next to each other, whispering over shared homework, drifting closer by the week, exactly the way the novel had promised its readers a slow-burn romance would unfold. I told myself, again, that it wasn't my problem to solve. I had promised myself I'd stay out of it. Standing on the sidelines and watching my own heartbreak play out in real time, in a body that used to feel things about this exact scenario for 2 straight years, turned out to be a much harder promise to keep than I'd imagined when I made it in the safety of my own bed. I was getting worse at believing myself with every passing week. The class party for our homeroom president's birthday should have been harmless. Bad karaoke, cheap soda, streamers somebody's little sister had clearly picked out, the usual manufactured chaos of 17-year-olds trying to feel like adults for one night. Then somebody suggested King's Game, the kind of dare-based drinking game that exists specifically to manufacture romantic tension out of teenagers, too nervous to make a move on their own. I knew what was coming. In the novel, this was the night the King's card lands on Sebastian and Theo, and Sebastian, cold, untouchable Sebastian, leans down and kisses him in front of the whole party, the first crack in his perfect composure, the moment everyone realizes he's finally, actually in love. It's a pivotal chapter. Readers had left over 1,000 comments on it. Except this time, the King's card landed on Sebastian and me. The room went dead silent. Somebody let out a low whistle. I could feel Theo's eyes on the back of my neck like a physical weight, could feel Sebastian's gaze land on me with an expression I couldn't read at all, not the polite blankness he wore for the rest of the world, something sharper, more focused. And I did the only thing I could think of, in the space of about 2 seconds, to keep the story from writing itself the way it clearly wanted to. "I can't," I said, loud enough for the whole circle to hear, my voice only shaking a little. "I'm seeing someone, sorry." It was a lie. Nobody in the room believed it less than Sebastian, whose jaw tightened just slightly before he schooled his face back into nothing at all. The group erupted into good-natured booing. Someone made me down 10 shots as the penalty for backing out of a dare, which felt, in the moment, like a perfectly fair trade for whatever tiny scrap of control I still had left over my own life. Our homeroom president, already 3 drinks in, declared loudly that this was the most dramatic King's Game in the history of Kingsley Prep, and that somebody should start a betting pool on what actually happened between the two of us. Nobody took the suggestion seriously that night. I'd find out 4 years later that several people had, in fact, taken it very seriously indeed. Sebastian left the party 20 minutes later without a word to anyone, cutting through the crowd like he couldn't stand to be in the room another second. He never got a second chance at the King's card that night, and Theo never got his kiss, standing by the drinks table with a hurt, confused expression that I chose very deliberately not to feel guilty about. I told myself that was a win. It didn't feel like one. It felt like standing in the middle of a highway, watching a truck swerve, and knowing it was only a matter of time before it came back around. 3 days into the long weekend, my best friend Callie Bishop dragged me, genuinely dragged, by the wrist, ignoring every protest I made from the doorway of my own bedroom, into a horror-themed escape room downtown with her boyfriend, a guy I barely knew from the debate team, and because the universe apparently has a sense of humor it likes to exercise specifically on me, Sebastian. "You owe me," Callie said, by way of explanation, dragging me through the parking lot. "I sat through your entire 2-year Sebastian Voss saga without complaint. The least you can do is survive one haunted room with me. I hate haunted attractions with the burning passion of 1,000 suns, a fact Callie knew perfectly well and had chosen to ignore. I lasted 5 minutes inside before I latched onto her like a barnacle, and when she and her boyfriend split off down a side corridor to solve a separate puzzle, cackling the whole way, leaving me alone with Sebastian and the debate team stranger in the dark, I nearly had a heart attack on principle alone. Then, an animatronic prop screamed to life 2 feet from my head, all jagged teeth and strobing red light, and I did what any rational person would do in that situation. I grabbed the nearest solid, warm human being and held on for dear life, eyes squeezed shut, heart hammering. That solid, warm human being happened to be Sebastian. He didn't push me off. He didn't even flinch, or say anything sharp, or do any of the things 2 years of history should have taught me to expect. He just put a hand on my back, slow and steady, and let me hide against his chest until my heart rate came back down to something survivable, standing perfectly still in the dark, like he had nowhere else in the world he'd rather be. It was such a small thing, a hand on my back, and it undid something in me that 2 years of chasing him had never managed to touch, not once, not in all the hallway run-ins and forgotten lunches and small, careful rejections. I pulled away eventually, mortified, babbling an apology I don't fully remember the wording of. He looked down at me in the dim, flickering light with an expression I'd never once seen on him before, something almost soft, almost unguarded, and said nothing at all, just watched me steady myself with an attention that felt entirely too focused to be casual. Later, when we escaped with 3 minutes to spare and made it out to a diner for dinner, the debate team stranger started flirting shamelessly with me over milkshakes, and Sebastian, cool, detached, allergic to drama Sebastian, cut the conversation off cold, mentioned some scheduling excuse none of us could verify, and steered us both away with a hand at the small of my back, easy and unhurried, like he'd rehearsed the gesture even though I knew for a fact he hadn't. I didn't understand what was happening to him. I found out faster than I expected. I never planned to tell anyone the truth about waking up in someone else's life. It sounded insane even inside my own head, and I'd resigned myself to carrying it alone for as long as this borrowed body lasted. Then Callie Bishop, 3 weeks after the escape room, caught me staring blankly at a printed-out chapter of Claimed I'd left open on my desk, highlighted and annotated like a hostage negotiation manual, and refused to leave my room until I explained myself. "Milo," she said, arms crossed, planted in my doorway like she intended to stay there until graduation if she had to. "You have been acting like a completely different person since September. Different vocabulary. Different handwriting, even. I've seen your notes. You flinch every time somebody says Theo's name like it's a curse word. I need you to tell me what is actually going on, or I'm calling your mom." So I told her. All of it. The falling asleep, the waking up, the novel, the nightmare, the plot I was apparently trying to outrun in real time with nothing but stolen memories and blind panic to guide me. I expected her to laugh, or worse, to look at me with the careful, concerned expression people reserve for friends they suspect need professional help. Instead, she sat down on the end of my bed, quiet for a long moment, and said the thing that ended up mattering more than anything else anyone said to me that whole year. "Okay," she said. "So if you're not actually the Milo who spent 2 years being pathetic about Sebastian Voss, why do you still act exactly like him half the time?" It was such an unexpectedly sharp question that I didn't have an answer ready. "Because," she went on, before I could figure one out, "from where I'm standing, it doesn't matter whose soul is currently driving this body. You still like him. That part didn't come with a body swap. You can spend the rest of the year running from a story you're terrified of repeating. Or you can just admit you actually want the thing you keep pretending you don't, and figure out how to get it without turning into a villain along the way. Those aren't the same problem, even if they feel like it from inside your own head. I didn't have a comeback for that. I still don't, 4 years later." Callie never treated the revelation like a burden to manage or a secret to tiptoe around. She just filed it away as one more fact about her best friend, alongside his terrible taste in horror movies and his inability to parallel park, and kept dragging me to things whether I wanted to go or not. She was the maid of honor at our courthouse wedding 2 years later, in jeans, holding a bouquet of gas station carnations, because it was the only flower shop open on a Tuesday. I don't think I ever properly thanked her for being the one person who let me be scared out loud instead of making me perform having it all figured out. 2 days after I told Callie the truth, our homeroom got roped into a scholarship fundraiser dinner the Voss group hosted every year, a black tie obligation neither of us could skip since Sebastian was expected to appear as the family's heir, and I'd been dragged onto the guest list as his close classmate. I spent most of the evening making small talk with donors and losing track of him in the crowd, right up until he reappeared at my elbow with a look on his face I didn't have a name for yet. He pulled me into an empty private room upstairs before I'd even caught my breath from dinner, guiding me in with a hand on my arm that I could have shrugged off if I'd actually wanted to, and the second the door shut behind us. I knew this conversation wasn't going to go the way any of my careful, story-avoiding scripts had planned for. "You said you were seeing someone," he said. Not a question. His voice was quieter than usual, almost careful. "I was lying," I admitted, because there didn't seem to be much point in anything else at this stage. Something shifted in his face, the mask slipping, just for a second, into something raw and unguarded that made my breath catch in my throat. He crossed the room in 2 unhurried steps, cupped my jaw in one hand, and paused there, close enough that I could feel the question in the air between us before he ever said it out loud. "Can I?" he asked low, giving me every chance in the world to say no. I didn't answer in words. I think my silence was answer enough, because a heartbeat later his mouth was on mine. Gentle at first, and then anything but. Nothing like the cold, controlled version of him the whole school thought they knew. It was fierce and a little desperate, like something he'd been holding back for 2 straight years and had finally let go of all at once. When we broke apart, I was shaking. He rested his forehead against mine, eyes closed, breathing unsteady, and for one long moment neither of us said anything at all, just stood there in the quiet, letting it be true for a few seconds before the rest of the world had to matter again. Then I remembered the nightmare, the gray hair, the hospital bed, the disgrace, all of it waiting for me down whichever path I let myself walk right now, and every ounce of courage I'd just found drained straight out of me like water through my fingers. "I'm sorry," I whispered and stepped back, putting a full arm's length of distance between us before I lost my nerve entirely. I like someone else. I watched something in him close off completely before I turned and ran, and I hated myself the whole way down the stairs. He caught up to me before I made it 3 hallways, grabbed my wrist, not hard, just enough to stop me, and said the thing I least expected to ever hear out of Sebastian Voss's mouth. Of all the things he could have said, "I was wrong about you," he said. "For 2 years. That's on me, not you. Every time you tried to talk to me and I brushed you off, that was me being an idiot, not you being anything less than you were. If you want to punish me for it, punish me. I'll take whatever you throw at me. But I need you to tell me the actual truth right now. Is there really someone else, or are you running because you're scared?" I hated how well he already knew me, after only a few weeks of actually paying attention. "Dominic." I lied again, grabbing the first name that came to mind, a classmate who'd flirted with half the school and meant none of it, including the one time he'd tried it on me, back before I ever knew what I was walking into. "I like Dominic Reyes." Sebastian went very still, something flickering behind his eyes that I couldn't name in the moment. Then, quietly, dangerously calm, in a tone that should have warned me more than it did, "Fine. If that's the truth, I'll respect it." He let go of my wrist. He didn't chase me down the hall a second time, didn't say another word, just watched me go with an expression I spent the whole walk home trying and failing to decode. For 3 days, I actually believed I'd gotten away with it clean. Right up until his phone call to Dominic's father made sure Dominic developed a sudden, urgent interest in not being anywhere near me for the rest of the semester, transferring out of 2 shared electives inside of a week without ever explaining why. I should have been furious about the manipulation. I told myself I was. Mostly, underneath that, I was terrified of how far he was already willing to go for something he'd only just decided he wanted. The Founders' Day dance rehearsals paired us off. In the original story, Theo and Sebastian, practicing late into the evening in the school's private studios, growing closer with every session, exactly the choreography the novel demanded of its 2 leads. The pairings themselves were drawn at random weeks earlier and posted on the athletics board before any of this ever started, which meant nobody, including Dominic, actually had a say in who they ended up with. With Sebastian pulling back from school for most of that stretch to deal with a manufacturing crisis at the family company, Theo got reassigned a new partner instead, Knox Sterling, a loud, reckless rich kid with a well-earned reputation for fistfights and a much less well-known habit of being hopelessly, secretly gone for Theo since the week he'd transferred in. I, meanwhile, was stuck with the partner the random draw had given me weeks before any of the drama started. Dominic Reyes, who spent every single rehearsal complaining loudly that fate had cursed him specifically, since backing out of a mandatory class requirement wasn't exactly an option, however badly he wanted to avoid me after everything with his father. The day Sebastian finally came back to school, drained and hollow-eyed from a week of overtime fixing a product recall that had made the evening news twice, he walked into the gym just in time to watch Dominic's hand settle on my waist mid-routine, exactly where the choreography said it should. I have never seen a room go quiet that fast, not before and not since. Sebastian crossed the entire gym floor in a straight, unbroken line, took my hand without a word to anyone in the room, and steered me straight out toward the parking lot. I dug my heels in the whole way, half out of pride and half out of the genuine terror of what might come out of his mouth next, given the mood he was clearly in. "You don't get to touch him," Sebastian told Dominic, in a voice so flat and cold it barely sounded human, not even bothering to raise it. Or has your father not heard yet about the incident at your family's restaurant chain out in Southgate? Dominic's face went white as printer paper. He let go of my hand faster than I'd ever seen him move in the entire time I'd known him. Sebastian didn't let go of my hand until we were both in the back of his car, the door shut, the privacy glass raised, the parking lot noise fading into nothing. I finally found the nerve to yank my hand free, chest heaving with more emotions than I could sort through in real time. You can't just drag me around like I'm something you own, I snapped. I told you already, he said, and his voice had dropped into that low, deliberate register that made my pulse do something entirely unforgivable. I want you next to me. That's not a request I'm making. It's just true, whether you agree with it or not. You don't get to decide that for me. Then decide it yourself, he said, closing the distance between us on the seat, not touching me, just close. Tell me you genuinely don't want this. Tell me you feel absolutely nothing when I'm near you, and I will stop tonight. I'll walk away and never bring it up again. I mean that. I opened my mouth to lie a third time, and the words simply wouldn't come out. He must have seen it on my face, because something in his expression cracked. Not triumphant, just unbearably relieved, almost young in a way I'd never seen him look before, and he reached out, took my hand, and pressed it flat against his own chest, over his heart. Feel that, he said quietly. His heart was pounding, fast and unsteady, nothing at all like the composed mask he wore for the rest of the world. That's what 2 years of watching you chase everyone but me did to me. I am not a patient person, Milo. I never have been. I'm just very, very good at pretending I am, for exactly as long as it takes to get what I actually want. I sat there with my hand over his heart, every carefully rehearsed excuse falling apart in my chest one at a time. I still like Dominic, I said. One last, weak attempt at the script I'd written for myself. He let out a short, humorless laugh, leaned in slowly enough that I had every opportunity to stop him, and kissed me. Softer this time, less desperate than the first, deliberate, in a way that felt like a promise instead of a demand. I kissed him back before I could stop myself, and when he finally pulled away, both of us breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine and murmured, "Liar." I didn't argue. There wasn't much point left in arguing. He handled the fallout with our homeroom teacher personally, in a private conversation I was never invited to and never asked about. I only found out the shape of it when Dominic transferred to a different elective the very next day, and never so much as looked in my direction again for the rest of the year. In the novel, this was the point where Theo and Sebastian's storyline crossed the last remaining line, private rehearsals at his family's estate, hands held openly in the hallways for the first time, the whole school treating them as an inevitability nobody would dare question. Instead, it was my hand he held walking into homeroom every morning, my name that got attached to his in every whispered hallway conversation. Every attempt I made to quietly transfer out, a new elective, a new lab partner, a different lunch table on the far side of the cafeteria, dissolved before it started, blocked by an influence I couldn't see, and absolutely could feel pressing on every edge of my daily life. I confronted him about it directly, eventually, the way I should have from the very beginning, instead of running every time it got difficult. You can't just override every decision I try to make, I told him, flatly. No more games, no more careful half-truths. If you want this to actually work between us, you don't get to make yourself the only option I'm allowed to have. That's not a relationship. That's a cage with better lighting. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I genuinely thought I'd finally pushed too far, that this was the moment the fragile thing between us finally broke for good. "You're right," he said eventually, and it visibly cost him something to say it, a muscle working in his jaw. "I'll stop interfering behind your back. But I'm not going to pretend I'll stop wanting you close, because that would be a lie too. Those are two different things, and I need you to actually tell me when I cross the line, instead of just running from me and letting me guess." It wasn't a perfect answer. It was, at least, an honest one, and over the months that followed, he actually kept it. Backing off visibly when I asked him to, checking in before he acted instead of simply assuming he already knew best. It didn't erase how our relationship had started, the manipulation baked into its foundation. But it was the first real sign that whatever this was becoming, it wasn't going to be the version of him written into the novel, the one who owned people instead of loving them. The actual performance, when it finally arrived, felt almost anticlimactic after everything it had taken to get there. The gym had been done up with more effort than a public high school auditorium had any right to receive. Actual stage lighting. A live string quartet the Parents Association had apparently just decided to hire. A backdrop of the school crest picked out in tiny white lights. Half the graduating class stood backstage in matching formal wear, doing the specific kind of nervous fidgeting that comes from knowing your entire extended family is somewhere in that audience with a phone camera already recording. Sebastian found me in the wings before our number, straightening the collar of my jacket with a focus that felt entirely disproportionate to the actual state of my collar. "You don't have to be good at this," he said. "You just have to survive it standing next to me. That's not remotely reassuring. It wasn't meant to be reassuring. It was meant to be true." When the lights came up and the quartet started, I forgot, for about 4 bars, that either of us had ever been afraid of anything. He was, infuriatingly, an excellent dancer, the kind of effortless, unstudied competence that made the whole thing look like something we'd been doing together for years, instead of 3 rushed rehearsals crammed in after his company crisis finally settled down. Across the floor, Theo and Knox moved through their own routine with the loose, easy chemistry of 2 people who'd clearly stopped pretending to hate the assignment weeks ago, Knox grinning down at him like he'd been handed something he hadn't dared to ask for. I caught Callie in the 3rd row, phone held up, mouthing something that might have been "I told you so," or might have just been enthusiastic nonsense. Either way, I nearly missed a step laughing. A few seats down from her sat a boy I didn't recognize, sharp-dressed, unmistakably related to Sebastian around the eyes, watching Theo's half of the floor with an intensity that had nothing to do with the choreography. Sebastian caught me looking and murmured, without missing a beat of the routine, "My cousin, Asher, he never comes to these things." I filed that away without thinking much of it, too busy trying not to step on my own partner's feet to wonder why, out of every event at Kingsley, this was the one Asher Kane had decided was worth showing up for. When the music ended, Sebastian didn't let go of my hand for the bow, and I didn't try to make him. Somewhere in the audience, a chorus of variously embarrassing parental cheers went up, and for one full unguarded minute, none of it, the novel, the nightmare, the plot I'd spent months trying to outrun, felt like anything that had power over me anymore. It just felt like a room full of people clapping for something that had actually, finally, become mine. By the time our college entrance exams rolled around that spring, half the grade already assumed we were a package deal, the kind of couple people stopped gossiping about specifically because the outcome had stopped being interesting. Sebastian had been accepted to an elite university overseas since sophomore year. A formality, everyone said, since a Voss heir barely needed a degree at all to eventually run the family empire waiting for him at graduation. He was standing outside the exam hall when I walked out into the afternoon sun, effortlessly striking in the middle of the crowd of exhausted seniors the way he always managed to be, without seeming to try. "How'd it go?" he asked, taking my hand easily like he'd been doing it for years instead of months. "Not great. I'll probably end up at some second-tier state school, honestly." "That's fine," he said, easy, unbothered. "College is just supposed to be fun, right? Go where you want. It doesn't matter to me." I didn't think anything of that sentence until move-in day at Ashcombe University 3 months later, when I turned around in the freshman dorm parking lot, arms full of a mini fridge box, and found Sebastian Voss unloading his own boxes into the building right next door to mine. "You turned down a top 10 university," I said, staring at him, box slipping dangerously in my grip. "To go here. With me, the company doesn't require a degree from me," he said simply, taking the box out of my arms before I dropped it, like that explained everything there was to explain. I figured I'd rather spend the next 4 years wherever you happened to be than somewhere you weren't. That night, in his new kitchen in the off-campus apartment his family had bought outright rather than let him live in a dorm, I watched him cook, actually cook, 3 dishes and a soup, laid out with the same quiet precision he brought to everything, something I'd never once seen him do in 2 full years of high school, and when I asked when exactly he'd learned, he just smiled and reminded me, unbearably fond, that I'd once, in a fit of pure pettiness during a fight neither of us even remembered the cause of anymore, demanded a boyfriend who could actually cook for me. I'd said that months before I'd even agreed to properly date him. He'd remembered it anyway, filed it away, and quietly taught himself in the time it took me to forget I'd ever said it at all. That was the moment I stopped being afraid of the story we were supposedly trapped inside, and started genuinely believing we might actually be writing a different one, page by page, on our own terms. I'd braced myself for the parents for 2 solid years before I actually met them, certain that whatever gauntlet awaited me would be worse than anything the novel had described, because reality has a way of exceeding fiction's imagination when it comes to old money and disapproval. The dinner happened the winter of our sophomore year of college, at a restaurant that turned out to belong to the Voss portfolio, in a private room where the staff called Sebastian young master, without a trace of irony, and nobody had to ask what anything on the menu cost. His mother arrived first, sharp-eyed and elegant in a way that made me acutely aware of every seam in my one good jacket. She studied me for a long moment before said anything at all. "So you're the one," she said finally, "who's been keeping my son in the country. I didn't ask him to turn down the university abroad," I said too quickly, bracing for whatever came next. "I know." She almost smiled, an expression that looked so much like Sebastian's that it startled me. "That's precisely why I'm not upset about it. He spent his whole life doing things because they were strategically correct. This is the first thing I've seen him do purely because he wanted to. His father was quieter, more interested in the wine list than in interrogating me, and spent most of dinner asking practical questions about my degree and my plans after graduation with the same tone he might have used evaluating a business proposal. Thorough, unemotional, oddly reassuring in its lack of drama. "You understand," he said toward the end of the meal, not looking up from his glass, "that our family doesn't require you to bring anything to this. No dowry, no merger, no strategic advantage. We stopped needing that from marriages 2 generations ago." "Then why does it feel like a test?" I asked, before I could stop myself. He looked up at that, something almost approving in his expression. "Because you're smart enough to notice it is one. Most people aren't. That's the actual test, and you've already passed it." Sebastian, beside me, hadn't said much through the whole exchange, but under the table his hand found mine and stayed there for the rest of the night, thumb tracing slow circles against my knuckles, like he'd been more nervous about the whole evening than either of his parents. "Told you it would be fine," he murmured, once we were back in the car. "You told me nothing of the sort. You told me not to worry about it, which is different." "Same thing," he said, unrepentant, and kissed my temple like it settled the matter, which, annoyingly, it did. By our junior year of college, we'd been together long enough that getting married felt less like a leap, and more like paperwork we'd both been putting off out of sheer laziness. I'd expected the Voss family to make it difficult at every turn, some ancient family objection to their heir marrying a middle-class nobody with no title and no fortune to bring to the table. Instead, parents barely reacted to the news at all, beyond a card and a very expensive bottle of wine sent to the apartment. "The Voss name doesn't need a marriage to secure anything anymore," Sebastian explained over dinner, clearly amused by how thrown I was by the sheer anticlimax of it. "They stopped caring who I married the day I turned the company's tech division around at 19. As far as they're concerned, I've already paid my dues to the family name twice over." So we went to the courthouse on an ordinary Tuesday between classes, in jeans, with Callie and Asher Kane, the same cousin who'd sat quietly through Founders Day years earlier and turned out to be far better at keeping a secret than at admitting one. As witnesses, signed our names, and got sandwiches afterward like it was any other lunch. By our graduation the following spring, we'd been married for a full year, a fact I repeated to myself daily, usually while chasing him around the apartment with a folder of divorce papers he refused, on principle, to ever actually open. Here's the part I'll admit to, because I promised myself when I started telling this story that I'd tell it honestly. The version of Sebastian that showed up after the wedding was not entirely the version I thought I'd signed up for. Before the courthouse, he was, if anything, restrained. Careful with me, even, in a way that felt almost old-fashioned. Once the ring was actually on my finger, something in him quietly decided the old rules didn't need to apply anymore, and every ounce of control he'd kept carefully leashed, for 2+ years came out to play instead, all at once, like a dam finally given permission to break. I'm not going to walk you through the specifics, because that's not the story I'm here to tell. What I'll say is, it turns out the campus rumor mill had been right about exactly one thing where he was concerned. Sebastian Voss, golden boy of Kingsley Prep, national poster child for composure and restraint, is an absolute menace behind closed doors. And every single time I think I've finally found his limit, he finds some new way to prove me wrong. What I will correct here, for the record, is one detail the original story got flatly wrong about him, because I think it matters. He does not get more worked up the more upset or overwhelmed I get. That's not the man I actually married, whatever some novel written by a stranger predicted about him. If he ever tried that, genuinely tried it, I'd have filed the paperwork that same night and meant it. What actually happens every time is the opposite. The second I'm overwhelmed, he slows everything down without being asked, checks in, makes absolutely sure I still want to keep going before he does anything at all. It's its own particular kind of infuriating, if I'm honest, because it turns out it's very hard to stay properly mad at someone who's being that careful with you while also being completely, relentlessly stubborn about getting what he wants in the end. Divorce, I tell him, some mornings, mostly out of habit at this point, more ritual than threat. You seduced me first, he says back, every single time, like it's a legally binding contract we both signed in blood. You don't get to walk away from your own crime scene. I have never once, in all our years of marriage so far, managed to argue him out of that sentence. It's not all teasing and standoffs over coffee either, whatever picture that might paint. There are quieter mornings too, the ones where he's already left for an early call with the overseas offices, and comes back to find me still half asleep on the couch, with my laptop open to unfinished work, and instead of waking me, he just drapes a blanket over me and starts making enough breakfast for two anyway, humming something tuneless under his breath, like he doesn't know I can hear him from the next room. There are the nights he comes home wound tight from a board meeting that went sideways, and instead of talking about it, he just wants to sit with his head in my lap while I run my fingers through his hair until whatever version of him needs armor for the rest of the world quietly steps aside for the version that only exists here, with me, where nobody else is watching. I think that's the part the original story never had room for, buried as it was under 200 chapters of scheming and spite. Not the drama. The ordinary, unremarkable tenderness underneath it. The part nobody writes a villain arc to destroy, because nobody thinks to protect it in the first place. 4 years after our Kingsley graduation, our old high school class organized a reunion at a rooftop venue downtown, and I dragged Sebastian along mostly so I wouldn't have to fend off small talk alone for an entire evening. The Voss name had grown even larger in the years since. Sebastian had taken the family's food and hospitality empire and pivoted a significant portion of it into consumer tech, and the phone brand he'd personally launched from scratch had cracked the global top 5 in sales within 3 years flat. He'd landed on a world's richest list that spring at an age most people were still paying off student loans, which meant our entire reunion was, functionally, 90 minutes of former classmates trying to talk to me specifically in order to get to him. He handled it the way he handles everything. Polite, distant, efficient, answering the same 3 questions from a dozen different people without a flicker of impatience. Until he finally excused himself from the crowd and came to sit beside me at our table, lacing our fingers together without a word. Our old homeroom president, now apparently running 3 restaurants of his own, leaned across the table with the particular enthusiasm of someone who'd had 2 glasses of champagne too many. Okay, but seriously, Milo, everyone in our grade assumed you two hated each other senior year. There was a whole betting pool after that King's Game disaster. I lost $20 on it. There was a betting pool? I asked, genuinely startled. A big one. Half the grade had you two as enemies to something within a year. Nobody had you married by 22, though. A classmate nearby, someone I vaguely remembered from group projects, gushed about how lucky I was, married to someone that handsome, that successful, that visibly attentive even in a room full of people vying for his time. You have no idea, I told her, and meant it in ways she wasn't remotely equipped to understand. Halfway through the evening, Theo Marsh finally arrived, dramatically late, dressed like he'd stepped directly out of a magazine spread, flanked by both Knox Sterling and Asher Kane, the two of them locked in a low-grade turf war over his attention that had apparently been ongoing, unresolved, for years at this point. Theo looked utterly exhausted by both of them, and somehow, visibly thriving on the chaos anyway, in a way that suited him far better than the careful, performative sweetness he'd worn back in high school. I watched the three of them bicker their way across the room toward the bar and glanced sideways at Sebastian, curiosity finally getting the better of 4 years of not asking. "Did you ever actually like him?" I asked. "Back in high school. Honestly, no deflecting." He looked mildly surprised by the question, then genuinely thoughtful, tapping one finger against his glass. "The first time I met him, something in me sat up and paid attention, like I was somehow supposed to like him, out of nowhere. For about 2 weeks I did, a little. Never anything past friend, though, if I'm being precise about it." He paused, that familiar, dangerous smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And then you showed up properly in my head right around then, and just never left again, and barely past friend turned out to be as far as it was ever going to get with him." It was Theo, of all people, who gave me the last missing piece of the story that night, cornering me by the drinks table while Sebastian got dragged into yet another circle of old classmates wanting business advice disguised as small talk. "I owe you an apology." "Probably for junior year," Theo said, swirling his glass, unusually candid for someone I remembered as carefully composed even in private. "Before I ever transferred to Kingsley, my family owed the Vosses a debt neither side really talks about anymore. A business thing, going back years. My parents genuinely told me that getting close to Sebastian, personally, might smooth things over between the families. I didn't know how to do subtle, so I just did everything, all at once, badly, and hoped some of it worked. I stared at him, recalibrating 4 years of assumptions in real time. "You mean you were never actually in love with him?" "God, no." Theo laughed, a real one this time, nothing like the careful performance I remembered from high school hallways. "I liked exactly one member of the Voss family the entire time I went to that school, and it was not Sebastian." He nodded toward the bar, where Asher, Sebastian's quiet, sharp-dressed cousin, the one who'd apparently found excuses to turn up at Founder's Day, the wedding, and now this, was currently losing an argument with Knox over who got to walk Theo to his car later, oblivious to being discussed. Asher, if you can believe it, took me 2 more years after graduation to even admit that to myself. You'd think I'd have picked an easier problem to have, all things considered. Knox at least says what he wants out loud. I laughed too, something in my chest finally. Fully unclenching after 4 years of quietly wondering whether I'd stolen something from someone who'd actually wanted it, whether some version of the original story's guilt still belonged to me even now. Sebastian found me again just as the party started winding down for the night, slipping an arm around my waist in that easy, unthinking way that had stopped surprising me sometime around junior year of college. "What did Theo want?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, and meant it, for the first time genuinely at peace with the story we'd both walked away from together. Just tying up a loose end that's been sitting open a lot longer than it needed to. We drove home that night with the windows down, city lights sliding past in long yellow streaks, and somewhere on the highway Sebastian reached over and laced his fingers through mine the way he had 100 times before, easy and unthinking, like it had never once been a fight to get here, like there hadn't been 2 years of silence and 1 very dramatic car ride to earn this exact ordinary moment. "You know," he said, glancing at me sideways at a red light, "you still have that folder of divorce papers in your desk drawer. I checked this morning. I like keeping my options open." He brought my hand up and pressed a kiss to my knuckles, unbothered, infuriatingly smug, the light turning green without either of us moving to accelerate right away. "Or you like that I keep talking you out of it every single time, and you'd be bored out of your mind if I ever stopped." I didn't answer, because he wasn't wrong, and because some story beats, the important ones, the ones that actually stuck, the ones we chose for ourselves, instead of the ones some novel wrote for us, turned out to be worth keeping exactly the way they were written. Somewhere behind us, in a drawer in an apartment we were slowly filling with a life neither of us had planned for, in quite this shape, an unsigned folder sat waiting. It's still there now. I have a feeling it's going to be there for a very long time. There's an epilogue to this story that the original novel never bothered to write, mostly because villains don't usually get one. 2 months after the reunion, I finally worked up the nerve to track down an archived copy of Claimed. The actual novel Milo Hart had spent 2 years reading in secret, curious whether the version of events I remembered from that one terrible nightmare matched anything on the page. It took some digging, The site had gone dark years earlier, and most of the mirrors were broken links. But I found a cached fragment of the final chapter eventually, yellowed with age, the way old internet pages get. It ended more or less the way I remembered dreaming it. The golden couple, triumphant, everyone else's unhappiness quietly swept off the page to make room for the credits. The villain got 2 sentences near the very end, a footnote about consequences, and then the story simply moved on without him, the way stories about people like that always do. I read it once, sitting on the floor of our apartment with my laptop balanced on my knees, and felt strangely little about it. Not triumph, not relief, just the flat, distant recognition of reading about a stranger who happened to share my old name. "What are you looking at?" Sebastian asked, dropping onto the floor beside me, glancing at the screen. "The ending I was supposed to get," I said, "before you decided not to cooperate with the plot." He read the fragment over my shoulder in silence, jaw tightening slightly at the description of what happens to the discarded fiancé in the final act, the disgrace, the isolation, the quiet erasure. When he finished, he didn't say anything clever. He just reached over, closed the laptop, and pulled me into him instead, chin resting on top of my head. "I used to wonder," he said eventually, "why it felt so urgent. Freshman year, I mean. Before whatever happened to you, happened. There was always this feeling underneath everything, like I was supposed to be moving towards something, drifting towards some ending that had already been decided without asking me. I assumed it was just what growing up in this family felt like. Everything mapped out in advance. And now I think some part of me always knew the map was wrong. I just needed you to show up and refuse to follow it before I had the nerve to throw it out myself." I didn't tell him that night about the part of the old chapter I'd left out, the line describing how thoroughly, how completely, the story's version of him forgot the villain ever existed at all once the credits rolled. I didn't need to. We'd already spent 4 years proving, one stubborn, deliberate choice at a time, that forgetting was never actually going to be an option for either of us. Some nights I still think about the boy who fell asleep on his couch with a bag of stale pretzels on his chest and woke up somewhere else entirely, half convinced he'd stumbled into somebody else's tragedy. I think about how close I came, in those first few weeks, to simply letting the story run its course, because it seemed easier than fighting something that had already been written. I'm glad, every single ordinary morning of this ridiculous, complicated, unreasonably happy marriage, that I didn't. I'm glad Callie dragged me into a haunted escape room I didn't want to go to. I'm glad a boy I barely knew once turned down a hallway seat next to a stranger and unknowingly rewrote the rest of both our lives. I'm glad, too, for the smaller, sillier things that never made it into any version of the novel. The 3 rushed rehearsals before Founders Day, the ridiculous marble countertops, the folder that never gets signed. And I'm glad, more than anything else, that somewhere along the way, the story stopped being something that was happening to me and started being something I got to help write. The folder of divorce papers is still in the drawer. I checked again this morning, out of habit. It's still unsigned, and at this point, I don't think either of us is holding our breath waiting for that to change. Tell us in the comments, would you have run from a man like that, or let him catch you? We read every single one of your answers, and honestly, they're the reason we keep telling these stories. If this one got under your skin, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next.